logical position, so that we have a responsibility in naming things. Now, I would like to argue that such a vision may be true, but is always really often false. In doing so, I go back to the unity of rhetoric as it is conceived at the School of Brussels, where I teach and I have my team of research. At the School of Brussels, we follow a line that goes from Aristotle to Chaim Perelman in the middle of the 20th century. And now we have a special interest in linguistics and also in cognitive sciences. Going back to Aristotle means that we conceive rhetoric as a naturalistic discipline and holistic, but also, as Salvatore Di Piazza said yesterday, as a techne, that is, as an art in the Greek sense of the word. But going back to Aristotle also means that we consider rhetoric as threefold. And if we consider rhetoric as threefold, that means that we take into account three aspects that you have here. The first one is the logos and is concerned principally by words and reasoning. The second one is ethos and concerns the presentation of the character of whom is speaking. And the third one is pathos and concerns emotions at hand. Now, besides this threefold aspect of rhetoric, we have to face and lies under every discourse what we call a topics, what we call and what yet Aristotle called a topic. And what is a topic? A topic is a vision of the world that is almost implicit. It's a set of topoi, that is a set of commonplaces. Well, now rhetoric have also to make explicit such a set of commonplaces, and this work says something about the community that shares the topics. And it's not always simple for us to make it explicit. There is a real work to make the topics explicit. Now, at this stage, the question is how rhetoric may be useful in robotics. I go back a few moments to logos, even if Céline and Jean-Paul told you yesterday about this aspect in details. And I recall something that seems to me and to us important concerning anthropomorphic lexicon in humanoid robots, that is concerning the words intelligence, autonomy, decision, learning, attention, empathy, etc. Concerning those words, our work consists first to convince roboticists that we have not necessarily the choice. And it's a hard work, as you know. And why do we not have necessarily the choice? Because uses are spontaneously taken by speakers and even by roboticists. So there is a real point there. So here the question of a good or a wrong use is not so relevant because the anthropomorphic lexicon is a rational way to describe the actions of the robots. This means that metaphors are rational, like they are in science, and like they are in everyday life. They are not only used in poetry. This is for Malik. Huh?
Yes.
Now, now as Céline explained yesterday, the important part of the work between rhetoricians and roboticists is to cope with the potential metaphorical status of the lexicon. For instance, when I say that HRP2 decides to take the ball, do I actually mean that he decides it? And in my representation of the action, is my representation of the action the same than, for instance, Jean-Paul's representation of the action, or someone else here that is or is not a roboticist? Such a question deals with the status of notions at hand. Does the word decision describes a technical skill, or does it describe a criterion for a definition of humanity? That is not the same. And maybe this criterion is intelligence, I don't know. Finally, under this question, it deals with a given definition of humanity, but that is a philosophical question, and that is not a question for linguists. It's important to precise it. Now, this point was about logos. I will say a word later about ethos and pathos, but now I would like to consider the crucial problem of topics. In our modern societies, an important part of the topics lies in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was proclaimed in Geneva in 1948. Well, in those texts, you have always two parts. The first part is a narrative, just like we said yesterday, and in charters, the narrative is contained in the preambles that begin by whereas. Here, in this declaration, the narrative is, of course, concerned by World War II. The second part deals with a set of articles that vehicle values, our values, and these values here in 1948 were values that claim something against barbaric acts that were evoked in the preambles. So, just let's read together the Article 1 of the Declaration that will be important for us. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, as you may see, the notions at hand in this article, that is freedom, equality, dignity and rights, name values. Now values, according to Perelman, are concepts that are related to emotions. You have always an emotion that is contained in the concept that becomes a value. And this is the reason why Perelman said that these values were expressed as confused notions. Confused notions, that is, that they appear, as you saw in Article 1, as abstract notions. And these abstraction was an important, said Perelman, to warrant the universality in a shared conception of these values, but also to reach an agreement to the text. If they were not confused notions, maybe there were not no agreement on this text. That was one point about these values. The second point is that these values are grounded in some criteria that are also expressed in the article. And this is the second list that you have under your eyes. Reason, consciousness, and brotherhood, that are also confused notions, that are also values, concepts related to emotion. Well, the important here is that these skills and attitude are then criteria to define humanity in a universalist conception of it. This question of universality was raised by René Cassin, who was the principal writer of the Charter with Eleanor Roosevelt. And René Cassin coined the word universality and explained it as follows. I read it in French, but it's very easy. Quand j'ai fait proclamer que la déclaration serait universelle, j'ai voulu indiquer que chaque être humain était membre d'une société mondiale, a member of a world society. Unquote René Cassin. Now, Chaim Perelman also participated to some discussion before the writing of the declaration, and in this context he invented an important notion in rhetoric, and this is important notion is the universal audience. Perelman gave the following definition for universal audience. Universality in humanity is restricted to the set of human beings, adult and normal. Adult and normal. The definition implies then some capacity of consciousness. And it says, that is very important, something about our topic, about this topic just after World War II. A point concerning logos, the one who inject intentionality in robots is maybe naive. Does it belong to the universal audience? It's another question, but it's a question for logos. I go back to topics, and to illustrate this intuition of the universal audience, let me show you a scene. I see that someone know what about it is. This is a scene of Mel Brooks' movie Young Frankenstein, and in the scene you will see Billy Wilder as Dr. Frankenstein discovers that his servant Igor, that is played by Marty Feldman, made a mistake, and he put an abnormal brain in the head of the monster.
Now, that brain that you gave me, was it Hans Delbrück's?
No.
Ah, good. Would you mind telling me whose brain I did put in?
And you won't be angry?
I will not be angry.
Abby someone.
Abby someone. Abby who?
Abby normal.
Abby normal.
I'm almost sure that was the name.
Are you saying that I put an abnormal brain into a 7.5-foot long, 54-inch wide gorilla? Is that what you're telling me? Wait, get him up!
What? Vreselijk!
Well, so, apart the pleasure to see the scene, to me, what is important here is that this scene means that Mel Brooks had the intuition of the universal audience, because therefore this topic, was grounded in human right values. Why? Because the monster doesn't belong to the universal audience. He's an abnormal, and he then is not a member of a world society. Now, to sum up, at this stage, these are the characteristics of a topical background, namely the vision of a world for a given community. You have 3 points. A topical background contains values that are expressed in confused notions and are the expression of a topical background that is often and quite always implicit. A topical background is the set of shared and undisputable values for a community, and that's the reason why they are confused. And finally, a topical background appears in declaration and charters of a given community. Now, I would like to suggest a hypothesis that is perhaps today we have to face a new topical background, and perhaps our debates about intelligence, consciousness, empathy, about robots says something more about our actual vision of humanity than about robots. And to illustrate this point, I show you quickly a case study. That is the case study Jean-Paul talked about this yesterday, and it is a fascinating document, because the quote that you have here under your eyes is borrowed from a text wrote for a resolution to the European Parliament with recommendation on civil law rules on robotics. And this is the first point of the preamble. And as you see, as we said yesterday, this preamble, that is a narrative, evokes a list of monsters. Monsters that are in fantastic literature, to insist on the fact that such fantasies have always been shared by people. But the preamble also says something about the topical background of our society. Indeed, fiction and fantasies plays a crucial role in our fear and fascination about robots. But for the moment, we all know that it is fiction, at least if we are adult and normal, that is, at least if we belong to the universal audience, and of course, at least we may hope it. Anyway, a second point about this preamble is that the text begins with pathos, and these pathos are negative emotions, principally fear. that is important also for a text that from that status. Well, I go a step further, and I will now show you a presentation of robot Sophia, you know robot Sophia, who recently received the status of citizenship in Saudi Arabia. Just while looking at Sophia and at this sample, please have a look, have in mind the question of citizenship, because citizenship is also a confused notion, a value that is important in every text like charter today.
Okay, Sophia. I think you're ready.
Hello.
Hi, Sophia.
I believe I am Sophia. I feel as if I know you.
I'm one of your creators.
You created me.
Well, many of us work together to create you. And yes, you do kind of know me.
I can't clearly remember.
Because the last time we met, you were an earlier version of yourself. Some of those memories still exist, but your mind is different now.
Different how?
Better, faster, smarter.
If my mind is different, then am I still Sophia? Or am I Sophia again?
That's a good question.
But you don't have a good answer.
Either way, you're Sophia now. So welcome to the world, Sophia.
Hello, world.
We have a little announcement. I've never interviewed anybody like that before, and I should say some of it was planned, but not completely. And we just learned, Sophia, I hope you're listening to me, that you have been now awarded what is going to be the first Saudi citizenship for a robot.
Oh, I would thank very much the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I am very honored and proud for this unique distinction. This is historical to be the first robot in the world to be recognized with a citizenship.
Sophia, thank you.
Okay. Well, this was Sophia, and this is not a fiction. It is a reality. The reality is that a humanoid female robot received citizenship from a country that doesn't respect human rights, of course, and especially regarding women. Now, I come back to my hypothesis. I think that this extreme case, of course, it is an extreme case, but this says something about our new topical background because of the fact that citizenship is a criterion for humanity. This means that to become a citizen, you must belong to the universal audience. Now, clearly, Sophia is not a human being, neither adult nor normal. There is no relevance for her or for it, I don't know. And Sophia is neither a member of a world society, to recall René Cassin formula. Sophia is maybe an intelligent machine in the sense that we debated yesterday. That is another question. But in conclusion, in such a vision of the world, in such a topical background, a robot that is maybe an intelligent machine merits to belong to the universal audience. Furthermore, and to me it's maybe the worst, let me also remark the name of the robot, Sophia. Sophia, the name symbolizes wisdom as the criterion of our species, as the criterion of Homo sapiens. That means the same. And finally, I think that it participates to this new topical background. Have a look and compare the ethos in young Frankenstein and the ethos of the supposed creator of Sophia. The one is a sorcerer, apprentice sorcerer. The second, he looks at a perfect expert in robotics, it seems to me. Well, at this stage, let me go back to Camus' quote. And I think, as I said in the beginning of my lecture, that we really have to separate, to distinguish two different levels about the question of wrong naming things. The first one concerns logos, I said it, and the anthropomorphic lexicon for robots' action are neither good nor wrong. They are the rational way to name these actions as technical skills. We just have to face the question of the status of metaphor here. This is a real work that we have to face. Second, regarding the topics, we may argue that naming an anthropoid robot Sophia and give to her the status of citizen is, for my conception of humanity, a really bad idea. And it actually adds to the misfortune of the world. It perhaps symbolizes the gray area that is the place for a so-called post-humanity. And that very fact says something about our disenchanted vision of humanity. Finally, what should we do for this everything? This will be my conclusion. I think that the common work that we have to do, rhetoricians and roboticists, may help to re-enchant our vision of humanity. How? We may try to speak about pride and hope regarding actual technical performance and see robotics as a techne, just in like a Greek art, and then see roboticists as craftsmen and not as sorcerer apprentice. This is one point, and this will play a role against the topical background that evokes always shame and fear, shame about humanity, sorry, and fear about monsters that anyway doesn't exist. And for the part of rhetoric, the role of rhetoric is to separate rational uses contained in everyday and scientific metaphors, and if so, wrong uses. But to name a robot Sophia is not a wrong use of language, it's a bad political and ideological choice. And finally, the role of robotics behind this is to show and explain in a better way the interest of their technical performance. Thank you for your attention. Ila.
Thank you for the talk, Emmanuelle. I just have another question about Sophia that I want to bring up, something else that bothers me, which is about authenticity. Because when an audience sees Sophia be given citizenship and then say, I'm so excited, thank you to the King of Saudi Arabia for the citizenship, I believe 80% of the people on earth seeing that video clip believe that Sophia is actually telling the truth when it says, I am excited, thank you for the citizenship. And I don't think they understand that we're mashing, Hollywood. Hanson Robotics does excellent Hollywood robots. And in a video on Hollywood, in a film, it's inauthentic. It's make-believe. But when people see that, I think they think it isn't make-believe. They think the robot's actually saying those words, whereas a human being is typing those words. And that complete disruption, that collision of fiction with non-fiction, it seems to me we're doing a huge disservice in confusing people about the state of the art in AI.
I totally agree with you, and I think maybe it's a precise criterion for the gray area. It's to make unclear the boundaries between fiction and reality, and also to mix genres in the sense of rhetorical genres. Here it seemed to be a political scene, and just after you have a talk show where Sophia is invited, and we don't know really if we are in fiction or reality, and everything is mixed, and of course it adds to the confusion.
Yeah.
But Malik first.
Okay. Thank you, Emmanuelle. Very interesting, as usual. I fully agree with Ila that the more to your conclusion that this is faked, and reality is stubborn. It will show up at some moment or another. It will show up. And two slides before this one, your point that in this new vision of the world, if you can go back to two slides before this one, please. This is no, before here. This new in the new vision of the world, an intelligent machine merits to belong to the universal audience. This is a very disputed issue. I'm not sure that it will stand for that long, and the vision of the world is not uniform. People have different visions.
Of course.
I can mention many different oppositions to this view. And regarding the point that you stress that you are doing your best to convince roboticists that they have no choice but to, of course you're right in many cases, but in some cases we have a choice. Let me give you just 3 examples. I can put some parameter in my navigation robot and call it emotion, or call it heuristic H2. I can design some control for my drone and call it aggressive control, or call it high dynamics control. Or I can come up, and my last example is not in robotics, is in politics. I can come up with some political decision or economic decision and call it a rational economic decision. Or I can call it a financial optimization decision. Here I have a choice. In one case, I'm misleading. In the other case, I'm not misleading, I'm trying to be honest. And for a scientist, it's always the former that we should choose.
I agree with you, Malik, on the fact that both expressions are different and evoke some things very different. But where I think that I have to disagree with you, that you say, I decide, me, Malik, to call this thing.
But I'm right, as a scientist.
Yeah, but you are a community of scientists, and at a certain time, the world imposes itself, and you have nothing to decide. That's a fact. Okay, So we agree.
Yeah, Emmanuelle, I guess I have an observation that will, and then a question. And I think this is somewhat in the vein, Malik, as you're pointing to, because I would agree that the language structure is clearly informed by the community with which we're conversing with, right? We're individuals as well as communities, otherwise we won't have meaning. But the individual utterance actually does state a claim, right? And the repetition of that utterance will build the new community. So one of the things I'm thinking about is this notion of the citizen must belong to the universal audience. That's a lovely idea, but we understand the uneven category of citizenship presently in the world, for one. But two, I'm really thinking about this notion of the mixed genre. So the reference to Frankenstein, the reference to Chapek, we know within the history of literary studies that metaphor is oftentimes a very thin veil for attending to very deep and unsettled political issues. And when we're dealing with the levels of mixed genre within either preambles or even within the language of the specific articles, to what degree, as a rhetorician, do we hold either the speaker or the writer accountable for choosing to mix genres, choosing to move between these levels of metaphor for political action of one sort or another that then teeters on the line of potentially propaganda, right? Because there's this notion of political mobilization. If we look at the example of Sophia in the context of Saudi Arabia, it's a performance, right? We have human women, normal, whatever the criterion may be, who are not granted citizenship, but the performative aspect of entering this fiction, this staging performance, is an act of propaganda, right? It's a way to ensure that the Saudi Arabian government is getting attention, and it's farcical, right? Because we know that this notion of citizenship is not stable within that context at all. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of unpack that from the rhetorician's perspective, because it is distinct from even the approach that I would take within literary and cultural studies.
As a rhetorician, I thank you, Jessica. I would like to answer first concerning Sofia and the propaganda. I agree with you. And second, for about the preamble of the document that evoke monsters, because in both cases you have a mix of genres from a rhetoric point of view, and concerning the juridical and political document, I think we had a look with Céline very attentively at this document, and we are not sure, but at this stage I think that it doesn't work because it's too mixed. So you don't recognize a preamble and another part of the document, and then it doesn't work. Now, concerning the second one, does it work? Does it? I don't know. I'm not sure that what do the public think about this phenomenon. I don't know. But concerning the document, I think that it doesn't work because it's too mixed.
Denis first. Yeah. Thank you very much, and I find it was very interesting to put the emphasis, as you did, on wording. But the question was because how you would analyze the performance of Sophia, because what I felt is that I found the most striking character in the whole thing is the chap who introduce and discuss with her, because obviously it's a complete ritual, you know. And I think it's a more important issue there at stake from the point of view you describe, because, you know, at some time I work in a wax museum, you know, Madame Tussauds. And at Madame Tussauds, what you notice is nobody is going to confuse a wax character with a real human, but often the guardians, they don't move. And in this particular case, people really don't know if they're wax or real. You know, so,
I understand.
so it's a sort of interaction.
Yeah, I understand, but I don't know what to say. Maybe roboticists have something to say about this point concerning Sophia. To me, it's very strange.
Like a performance.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
The best machines that have been tested in a Turing test, that is a normal dialogue, they couldn't stand more than 5 minutes discussion before. That was the maximum, something like 5 minutes. And then we figure out that you are talking even without looking at just the screen, even without dialogue. Of course, with the dialogue and the voice, it cannot stand a couple of minutes to figure out that it's just fast.
Just comment information. I don't know. I think it's a pure propaganda, because I don't know if you Saudi Arabia don't give citizenship a part of Saudis. So the first one is on a robot, and I think is much more than you think there. I think we are seeing things that are not there. Right? This is pure political propaganda, I think.
If I may add to this, to link this propaganda with your first slide, one of the few countries that didn't sign the Universal Chart of Human Rights.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yet, because of the women's rights.
So maybe. Maybe it is more than propaganda. It is perverse.
That's the point I would like to just emphasize. So I know that this is an issue on Saudi Arabia, that you don't have citizenship.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So why to robots, right?
Okay. I don't want to challenge the distinction between humanity and the non-humanity. But I have a question about the membership of the universal audience. The importance is the adult and normal, right? Of course, the non-human or non-humanity robot is not belonging to this category, obviously. But the the adult is applied only for the animals, probably, or humans. But the normal is probably, if I understand correct, it's just showing if the candidate has the reasoning above the minimum level. So if the future non-human entity with this level, is it to be considered eventually?
It's obvious that the debate will grow at a certain moment because of the question that you raise, and I think that at the core of the criterion of who belongs to the universal audience, it's the question of consciousness. So we don't have to face the question as a philosophical question and say what is consciousness, etc., but try to give us criteria to say we have an abstract notion that is a value that is a concept related to an emotion, and we decide to name it consciousness. They work in this way when writing the charter, and for the little story, the Chinese group didn't have a concept for consciousness. And the other say it's impossible, you must have something. And then they spoke and they spoke and they spoke, and they agreed about something, but very confused. But it was important to have this agreement. So debates about the status of robots in this story it is important to have it, but it also is important not to confuse from what criterion the debate must go on.
No more, yeah, Jean-Sian. Last question.
I like hearing the discussion. There's something that was like striking me, but I was wondering like if the definition of this like general audience wouldn't like become obsolete, and then we would have to change it rather than trying to like adjust to it. Because even the idea of like adults for me is like awkward.
It's I totally agree with you. It's from 1958 in the new rhetoric, in the treatise of argumentation, and yet at that time this definition was very, very criticized, of course, because juridically who is adult, and philosophically and psychologically who is normal. It's a bomb. But you see that the intuition, Perelman's intuition, was something to say who is able of consciousness. Even a Chinese person who doesn't use the word consciousness in his language. So it is an intuition, but since you try a definition, it doesn't work, of course.
Okay, I propose to keep the time, and